Finally, veteran CBS investigative reporter Sharyl Attkisson left the network this week, citing liberal bias that got in the way of her reporting on such stories as the Benghazi incident. CBS, for its part, accused Attkisson of having her own conservative bias. Katie McHugh, what does this story tell us about bias in media?
I think an almost undue focus has been placed on, the part about liberal bias. What I found more interesting is that there's been a lack of emphasis on investigative reporting that, we desperately need for any kind of government, no matter who heads it. And that I think that comes in large part from also the corporate sponsorships putting pressure on people. Investigative reporting is very time-consuming, it's costly, and it might not generate as many hits as like a little Upworthy headline that's feel-good and cute. So I'm not so sure that this is liberal, but she does have an excellent point there. I've watched the Overton window move so far to the left, especially since Obama's re-election, that it's very difficult to even report honestly. It's like, well, we have some corruption here in the Obama administration. Voters should know this. That's ideological somehow. And it's also interesting too that by saying that Sharyl seems agenda-driven, she's automatically seen as guilty, like non-liberal, bad. So it's just, I don't like her motives being questioned by this sort of attitude, and I worry about the future of the press whenever someone's trying to do honest reporting on legitimate scandals as being impugned as ideologically driven.
I think I always fall back when we look at something like this, and this will shock some people at the table. Of something I heard Cornel West say when I was back in school, that as a black man, he was very much aware of color, and so how could he expect non-colored people to be colorblind themselves? And I think when you talk about journalism, how can we expect really journalists to push aside their political philosophies, their philosophies in general, and present an unbiased, I guess almost colorblind version of the news? News reporters who report the news, who do the investigations, who direct the news and decide what's going to be put on there, of course they're going to be influenced by their political beliefs and their philosophical beliefs. So, I think what we need to do is we need to hope that people have a love for journalism and are able to look at that and say, maybe I'm being a little bit biased here, and we should go with a little bit more of this person's point of view.
And Nick, would you like to?
Yeah, I think our media is actually biased conservatively. I mean, when you look at how our media has evolved over the past 40 years in particular with a political shift to the right, compare it to any time, during the Vietnam, even during the Reagan era, it was a lot more liberal. It was a lot more left-leaning, just like the political establishment was. When you compare it to other kind of wealthy countries as well, other OECD countries, it's also more right-wing. So I think that the only way in which you could consider that our media has a liberal bias is if you consider it really in like a bubble of the present, not contextualizing it really historically or around the world. I'd also like to say that there's a couple kinds of bias, in my opinion. There is subjective bias, which is when you present two opinions, and you give one preferential kind of treatment, and two opinions which there's no kind of factual underpinning. But then there's objective bias, which is when you have a factual underpinning that falls squarely on one side of the issue, yet you still give equal time to two perspectives. I'll give a couple examples. One of them is climate change. We've known about climate change for 50 years now that it was happening. We didn't know it was anthropogenically caused, but we've known it for 50 years. And for the longest time, kind of corporate media has been putting up industry-funded climate change deniers right alongside, be it IPCC professionals and researchers, people who devote their lives to this, and so spinning this false controversy in this way. The one other example that I'll give is in the example of trickle-down economics. Our media talks about trickle-down economics as if we've never tried it before, and that's just not true. In the 1890s, we tried it. We called it horse and sparrow economics. In the 1920s, we tried it also. And guess what it led to? It led to the Gilded Age. It led to Standard Oil controlling 95% of the oil market. It led to the robber barons. It led to monopolies across all sectors, across many sectors of different industry. And it also led to the Great Depression. So that's something that I think our media, a responsible media, would be telling us about. Because these things need to be contextualized historically. We treat it as if it's the first time that it's ever happened, as if it's never existed before, but we have examples in history, and we're not taking those lessons from them.
It was interesting you brought up the climate change thing. There was a report that came out that ABC, CBS, and NBC had not had any climate change doubter scientists on in, I think it was almost a year and a half, as opposed to having several, climate change driven scientists on.
That's changing now.
Well, it's I don't know if it's changing now, but there's the bias that showed up in that one in your argument. So it was just interesting you brought that up.
For decades, it was that way, and we knew it was true for decades. So I don't see how you explain those decades, which we were doing that.
And Ben?
I would agree with Katie that it's important to have good, strong investigative reporting in all of our news networks. We need a lot more of that. The best reporters are often being laid off because they're considered too expensive, and it's very unfortunate. I don't know the specifics of this case internally at CBS well enough, but I would think a better solution would be to balance. If she was overly zealous in investigating the Obama administration from their perspective, then maybe you would have other reporters who are overly zealous in investigating Republicans. You could balance it out that way. But I would prefer that to laying people off for being overly zealous in their investigative journalism. And moreover, I think this does call attention to a larger problem, which is the large degree of corporate ownership of our media, which has increased a lot in recent decades, but it's much higher than in most other OECD countries. And you never really know what their motives are, right? What the corporate motives are for it, because they're private corporations and they can do whatever they want to do with their journalists, and there's not a lot of transparency there. So I think that's a problem.